In the previous lecture, I tried to bring out the importance of prices or the level of prices in our lives. And we know prices are determined in a market. And market has two sets of economic agents, one called the buyers or the buyer, and the other called the seller or the sellers. When they interact with a view to exchange goods and services, or once the transaction is complete, prices get determined. And our interest, of course, is to figure out how our price is determined and how and why do they change. A byproduct of price determination is quantity traded. What is quantity traded? Once again, it is the amount bought and sold. And like we are interested in the case of prices, we ask the same or similar questions. How's quantity traded determined, and how and why does that change? As a first step, we'll try to understand the economic behavior of buyer or buyers, and then we'll move on to understand the behavior of seller or sellers. And once we have accomplished or studied each of them independently, we'll bring both of them together and try to understand market equilibrium and then how prices are determined. So as a first step, we'll try to understand the behavior of buyers, and buyers we know demand goods and services. And as a first step, we need to define demand, and that's what we do next. And we need to understand what we mean by demand. Now this is a formal definition of demand. Demand is the desire to consume goods or and services backed by the ability to pay for it. Now there are two parts to the definition of demand. The first is the desire to own or consume certain things. And on top of that, we require people to have money in their pocket. For example, I'm a professor and I would like to buy a nice sporty car like a Porsche or a Ferrari. But given my salary, I just cannot afford it. So I have the desire, but I do not have the money to pay for it. From an economics perspective, my desire to have or own a Ferrari or a Lamborghini does not constitute demand. So what we are looking at essentially when we talk about demand is a class of serious consumers. And they want to have something and they also have the money in their pocket to buy it. Now, if they believe the price is right, they'll go ahead and buy it. But if they believe the price is not right, they will not buy it. So essentially what we are looking at are serious consumers who have the capability to buy this good, and of course they desire it. Now to understand demand, what we'll do is we'll look at a hypothetical example of black unsweetened coffee. And this is what we want to analyze. We want to understand how many cups of coffee does this person buy, and we want to analyze this in great detail. And we will assume that sugar is sold separately. So if you want sweet coffee, you have to pay extra money for sugar. If you want to put creamer in your coffee, you have to pay extra money for creamer. But the key thing here is as far as demand goes, we are looking at black unsweetened coffee, and we are trying to understand how many cups of coffee would this person buy in a day, week, and so on. So let us try to understand demand for black. So this is what we want to understand or analyze, because this constitutes the behavior of the buyer, and that is to demand something. And we, as an example, we are looking at demand for coffee. Since we'll be using quantity demanded of coffee again and again, let us abbreviate this as QDC, and we'll measure this in terms of number of cups, say per day. Now let us just try to make a guess. What would your demand for coffee depend upon? The first thing that will come to your mind is your tastes and preferences. Do you really like coffee? Is it hot outside or is it cold outside? What kind of demand for coffee are we looking at? Cold coffee or hot coffee? Have the doctors told us coffee drinking is good for us or bad for us? And so on. Where do you live? If you live in the western part of the world, say US, Europe, coffee, culturally people like to have more coffee. But if you go to countries like India or part of the British Commonwealth, what you find is they prefer tea. So anyhow, our tastes and preferences in a way determine our demand for coffee. Another factor which could impact my demand for coffee is how much money I have in my pocket, or income in general. And let us abbreviate income as I, and we measure this as in dollars per day. Another factor which could perhaps explain, say, demand for coffee is how expensive it is or how cheap it is. So price per cup of coffee also becomes a relevant variable to explain demand for coffee. Let us abbreviate this as PC, and we measure this as in dollars per cup. Now, if you are like me and you would like to have sweet black coffee, price of sugar also becomes relevant. Why? Because for me, the cost of coffee is not just the cost of unsweet black coffee, but also the cost of sugar. So price of sugar also becomes a relevant factor to explain demand for coffee. And let us assume, or let us measure this as in dollars per teaspoon. Now I'm from India, and I could have tea in place of coffee or coffee in place of tea. So for me, whether I'll consume tea or coffee would also depend upon what is the price of tea. If coffee is relatively less expensive, I will buy more coffee. If coffee is relatively more expensive relative to tea, I'll buy more tea. And let us abbreviate price of tea as PT, and this is measured as in dollars per cup. So what we have done is we started out to examine the demand for black unsweet coffee, and what we have done here is listed a bunch of variables which could perhaps explain quantity demanded of coffee. So now let us fashion and in a more formal way. Now what we are trying to understand is quantity demanded of coffee, or QDC, and this is what we call the dependent or the endogenous variable. Endogenous and dependent mean one and the same thing. And then what we have done is we thought about what constitutes and how can we explain demand for coffee. We listed a bunch of variables which could explain demand for coffee, and that happens to be price per cup of coffee, price of sugar, price of tea, income, and taste and preferences. Now, the way we have written out all this, we believe that these bunch of variables are responsible for, say, demand for coffee, or these variables cause changes in demand for coffee. So PC, PS, PTI and TP are all called independent or exogenous variables. Independent and exogenous mean one and the same thing, and so we can use them interchangeably. Or in other words, in terms of causality, we believe changes in independent variables, IV, cause changes in dependent variables, or dV. Now we can write all this in a compact fashion. Quantity demanded of coffee is a function of, so F stands for function of, and here we have all these independent variables, and once again we know the direction of causality. This is very important to remember, the direction of causality. And independent variables cause or determine dependent variables. Now we want to analyze the impact of these independent variables on demand for coffee. One way we can do it is look at the impact of all these variables together, but then that will make life very hard for us. So what we'll do instead is we'll try to make life easy for ourselves, or keep life easy for ourselves, and what we'll do is we'll look at the impact of one independent variable, for example price per cup of coffee, on quantity demanded of coffee. When we do that, we will assume all these other independent variables are constant, or they do not change. So this we can do under the assumption called Ceteris paribus. What is Ceteris paribus? It simply means holding all other variables as constant. So by invoking Ceteris paribus, we can isolate the impact of price per cup of coffee on quantity demanded of coffee. When we invoke Ceteris paribus, in a way what we have done is we have moved into an abstract world where from the real world situation we've assumed all other factors are removed, and we are just trying to look at the impact of one independent variable at a time. Now we have decided to analyze the impact of price per cup of coffee on quantity demanded of coffee, and we must keep in mind that we have invoked Ceteris paribus. That means we are holding all other variables except for price per cup of coffee as constant. So we are permitting price per cup of coffee to change, and we look at its impact on demand. So in the next video, what we'll do is we'll look at an example of this relationship and also derive the law of demand. So thank you, and my next lecture will be on this part.